Hello, everyone, and welcome to this York Festival of Ideas event. My name is Rob Davis. I'm a research associate at the Department of Philosophy at the University of York. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lawrence Shapiro, who is Berendt Entz Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research spans philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. His most recent book, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, How Philosophy Can Save Us From Ourselves, is co-authored with Stephen Nadler. Today, he'll be explaining why the tools of philosophy offer a powerful antidote to today's epidemic of irrationality. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you for that introduction, Robert. And I'd like to thank the folks at the York Festival of Ideas for inviting me to this fantastic several days of interesting events. I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm now going to share my screen and talk you through the contents of the book that Steve Nadler and I wrote together. Neither Steve Nadler nor I have written a book like this before. I'm a philosopher of mind, interested in the nature of mental events and philosophical issues concerning psychology and cognitive science. Steve is a scholar of early modern philosophy, working on such 17th century figures as Descartes and Spinoza. However, we're both trained as philosophers, and it's as philosophers that we watch events in our community and state, in our country and around the world, with great concern, even alarm. We all recently experienced the global COVID-19 pandemic that took so many lives and decimated economies around the world. But what is equally and perhaps even more worrisome is another pandemic. It's a pandemic that, while less visible than COVID, not only exacerbated its tragic effects, but that wreaks havoc on a more extensive basis. We're talking about a pandemic of irrationality, or what we in our book call bad thinking. Bad thinking is rampant in our country, in the United States, as evident in the following depressing facts. A quarter of Americans, a year following the 2012 Sandy Hook school shooting, in which Adam Lanza murdered 6 staff members and 20 children, denied that the shooting actually took place. Nearly 1/3 of Americans deny that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, insisting on a far smaller number. A quarter of Americans believe that the sun orbits the earth. And my favorite, 7% of Americans believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. 48% are unsure where it comes from. Within our field of philosophy, the term epistemology refers to the study of knowledge. A philosopher concerned with epistemology seeks a theory of rationality. Such a theory will explain why some beliefs are justified and some not, as well as why some true beliefs qualify as knowledge while others do not. Although many issues within epistemology have become too abstract and technical for the non-specialist, nearly every person can appreciate the importance of evidence in justifying a belief. We all can or should acknowledge that tea leaves or fortune cookies are bad reasons to believe something, whereas firsthand experience, rigorous experimentation, or the testimony of experts are good reasons. The epistemically stubborn person refuses to tailor his or her beliefs to the available evidence. They continue to believe, for instance, that the COVID-19 vaccine is dangerous, despite a wealth of evidence to the contrary. Public figures like Robert Kennedy Jr., an anti-vaxxer, draw large crowds of credulous people to his rallies. Typically, the fault is not ignorance of the facts. One would have to be living in a deep hole not to have been exposed to widespread reports of the coronavirus's danger and the vaccine's efficacy and safety. Rather, the problem is a stubborn refusal to see the facts as repudiating what one wants to believe. epistemic stubbornness is its own kind of disease, and arguably even more dangerous than COVID-19. Yes, COVID-19 has, in all too many cases, been lethal, but epistemic stubbornness is the force driving a resistance to the very vaccines that would have prevented these deaths. In fact, epistemic stubbornness manifests itself across a broad spectrum of issues of the utmost importance. Here in the United States, we see epistemic stubbornness lying behind persistent but patently absurd claims that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. It's beyond doubt that the most recent presidential election was fair and that Trump lost. Justification for believing that Biden won the presidency fair and square is overwhelming. Those who deny this outcome are, like those opposed to the COVID-19 vaccine, probably not dumb or stupid. Rather, they're irrational in that, badly misled by cynical and self-serving politicians and pundits, they simply refuse to believe a conclusion to which the evidence so clearly points. They are governed not by reason, but by desire or passion. They simply want to believe that Trump won the election, and it's that desire, rather than evidence, that forms the basis of their belief. We see the same kind of epistemic stubbornness in the denial of climate change. Can the research data and many computer models that show the effect of fossil fuels on climate be mistaken? Can reports of melting glaciers, rising sea levels, increasingly violent storms, and extraordinarily hot temperatures all be a hoax? Epistemically stubborn people can be very creative in devising stories that deny the evidence. This is just another symptom of their disease. They settle on a proposition they want to believe and refuse to accept evidence to its contrary. Can it be a coincidence that climate change denial is stronger among those who live in the states that produce oil or coal? Familiarity with some basic philosophical concepts offers one possible treatment for epistemic stubbornness. A deeper understanding of why some beliefs are justified and some not, or why some beliefs, even true ones, might nevertheless fall short of knowledge, allows one to reflect more carefully on whether one should believe something. Perhaps even more usefully, a background in basic epistemology equips one to challenge others when you see that their beliefs lack proper support. Developing a theory of justification, knowledge, and their relationship is the main business of epistemology. To justify a belief, you must provide reasons for thinking that it's true. Being justified, however, is not the same as being true. A belief might be true, but unjustified. Suppose, for instance, you correctly believe that on this date, 100 years from now, it will be raining. Surely, in this case, it's hard to imagine how one could be truly justified in a belief about a meteorological event so far in the future. Your belief happens to be true, though, suppose, despite being unjustified. Likewise, some false beliefs might enjoy tremendous justification. Just think, for example, of Newton's physics. For centuries, Newton's ideas about force and mass seemed so well confirmed that no one in their right mind could think that they were false. Yet we now know, with Einstein's help, that they are. Your belief at the very start of the 20th century that force is the product of mass and acceleration was justified, even though we now know it's false. Similarly, before Galileo's discoveries of the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, and other astronomical phenomena in the 17th century, one would have been justified in believing that the sun and the other planets and stars revolved around the earth. Knowledge, as epistemologists understand the concept, is something like the sum of truth and justification. One can never know something that's false nor can you claim to know something, even something true, without having justification for your belief. But we can put aside these somewhat abstract ruminations on concepts like justification and knowledge and focus on some real practical benefits that have emerged from the millennia that philosophers have spent thinking about them. As we try to understand how to be rational, how to ensure that one's beliefs are properly justified and most probably true, philosophers have sought to establish rules of good thinking. When lay people talk about arguments, they typically have in mind unpleasant confrontations. Philosophers, on the other hand, think of arguments as strategies for justifying a belief, almost like soccer coaches might think of set plays as strategies for scoring, or doctors might think of treatment plans as strategies for curing. And just as the good coach will recognize when the circumstances are right for this play, and the good doctor will understand when this rather than that treatment is appropriate, the good reasoner will appreciate when one kind of argument rather than another serves to justify a particular belief. Among the various kinds of arguments that philosophers catalog are deductive arguments, inductive arguments, and abductive arguments, also sometimes called inference to the best explanation. Each kind of argument works in its own distinctive way and gets evaluated by its own particular standards. For instance, we've probably all heard of deductive reasoning. Passing familiarity with Sherlock Holmes stories brings many examples. But while intending no offense to Sir Conan Doyle, Sherlock's storied feats of reasoning almost never involved deduction. Measuring Holmes's reasoning by deductive standards, we should think he's an idiot. On the other hand, when we recognize that Sherlock's reasoning employs a different form of argument, inference to the best explanation or abduction, we can appreciate his genius. I mention this not to discourage people from reading A Scandal in Bohemia, but to emphasize the value of and need for understanding what an argument is and the extent to which an argument can justify a belief. This is not to say that people who are unable to speak at length about various forms of arguments cannot be good reasoners. Many people, most in fact, can reason well without a course in logic or probability. On the other hand, the philosopher brings to the table an explanation for why certain kinds of reasoning will be successful, why it makes sense to look for one form or another of justification, given the belief in question. Before leaving the topic of epistemic stubbornness, it pays to consider an error in reasoning that is especially prominent in conspiracy theories. This is an error that philosophers diagnose with the help from a mathematical result that the Reverend Thomas Bayes, a statistician and philosopher, discovered in the late 18th century. We needn't concern ourselves with the actual theorem that Bayes proved. Its application to epistemology is fairly easy to explain. Think about a test that will tell you whether you'll lose your teeth by the time you're 60. Suppose you take this test and it tells you with 90% reliability that you will indeed lose your teeth. Should you be concerned? Should you begin reading Amazon reviews of dentures? Bayes' theorem tells us that the information I've provided you does not justify any decision. We don't know whether a positive result on the test, which is correct 90% of the time, is cause for concern before we know the percentage of people who suffer from tooth loss generally. Is tooth loss common or is it rare? Here's why this question matters. Suppose the chance of losing one's teeth is something like 1%. That's to say that in any group of 100 people, one of them will probably lose their teeth by the time they're 60. Each tooth in this slide is representing a person. Our test for toothlessness, I said, is 90% accurate, which I interpret to mean that if 100 people take the test, it'll be wrong about 10 of them. Around 10 people out of the 100 will test positive for future toothlessness, even though they will not end up losing their teeth. On the other hand, the test will correctly identify, most of the time, the one person who actually will lose their teeth. This means that if you test positive and the test is 90% accurate, you really have only about a 1 in 11 chance of needing dentures. You're much more likely to be one of the 10 people who falsely tested positive for toothlessness than the one person about whom the test was right. How does this perhaps surprising and unintuitive finding apply to conspiracy theories? The lesson from Bayes is that when we consider what to believe, we need to think about not just the evidence for the belief, that is the test in the tooth example, but the probability that the belief is true even prior to considering the evidence. The fact that only 1 in 100 people will lose their teeth. So when, for instance, a member of QAnon tells us that the United States is being run by a small cabal of pedophilic Democrats, we must ask not just about the strength of the evidence for such a cabal, but the probability that a small group of pedophilic Democrats really is in charge of the United States. Because this seems on its face so extremely unlikely, think about all the individuals and institutions that would have to be involved in such a conspiracy, all the children and their parents who would have to be kept quiet, all the news organizations that were either in on the conspiracy or unable to find a shred of evidence in its favor, etc. That even if we think that the evidence for the cabal was pretty good, say 90% reliable or whatever, this still means that the chance that such a cabal actually exists is quite small. Even if, say, we had a witness or 2 or 10 who claimed to have seen this cabal in action, we would have to weigh this positive evidence against the sheer improbability that such a cabal exists. And by this way of balancing the books, we should still end up denying the existence of the cabal. Just as it's far more likely that a positive test for toothlessness is wrong, given the low rate of toothlessness in the general population, it's also far more likely that the witnesses are mistaken or lying than it is that their reports are true, given the diminishingly small chance that a group of pedophiles can secretly govern the country. This same point applies in a general way to pretty much any conspiracy theory, whether it involves a flat earth, aliens building the pyramids of Egypt, or radio transmitters and COVID vaccines. And something like a slogan, the less likely the event in question, the better evidence we need for justifying a belief that it's occurred. By my way of thinking, no conspiracy theory meets this standard. So far, I've been focusing on epistemology, on issues involving justification and belief. Epistemically stubborn agents clearly violate the demands of rationality. But some philosophers have also connected this failing to the demands of morality. Not only is it wrong for epistemic reasons to believe something that lacks adequate justification, but it's wrong to do so for moral reasons as well. The British mathematician and philosopher William Clifford made this point in 1877 in an essay called The Ethics of Belief. Clifford argued, and I quote, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Of course, there are many ways, different ways, for something to be wrong. For instance, stealing is wrong for the harm it causes the victim. It is also wrong because it breaks a law. Perhaps it's wrong as well for the example it sets to others who see you profiting from your misdeed. In what ways is it wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence? Clifford uses an example to answer this question. Imagine, he asks, a ship owner who sells passage to poor immigrants on a transatlantic journey to a better life. He does so without taking care to justify his belief that the ship is seaworthy, trusting its integrity to providence. Perhaps he never bothers to have his ship inspected. Worse, he may have ignored the advice of previous inspectors, leaving the ship's safety open to question. The ship leaves port with a load full of passengers and sinks in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and, Clifford says, told no tales. By Clifford's reckoning, the ship's owner and the safety of the ship is wrong not just for epistemic reasons, because it lacks sufficient evidence, but for moral reasons as well. Neglect of evidence leads to numerous avoidable deaths. And what if the ship had not sunk, but had made it safely to the American shore? The ship owner is still morally at fault, Clifford argues, because it's just luck that prevented a disaster. The person who drives drunk does something morally wrong, even if, by good fortune, she makes it home safely. Clifford's point has a special salience today. Belief that lacks adequate justification is not just an epistemic breakdown, a breakdown that might on its own not seem terribly consequential. It may as well constitute a moral calamity, as happens when irrationality spurs harmful decisions. The consequences of irrationality and bad thinking are not limited to what we happen to believe, as we just saw when reflecting on Clifford's argument that believing on insufficient evidence might be both epistemically and morally wrong. What we believe and why we believe it also matters greatly in a very practical way, insofar as our actions are typically driven by our beliefs. Epistemic stubbornness is often accompanied by a kind of normative stubbornness. What we mean by this is that we all too often act without sufficient reflection on what we're doing and why we're doing it. This is especially apparent when it comes to exercising authority and applying rules. Here are a couple of examples. In a high school in Madison, Wisconsin, where Steve and I live and teach at the University of Wisconsin, a Black security guard is dealing with a disruptive student who is also Black. While being led away by the guard, the student is repeatedly calling him a racial slur. The guard tells the student several times, "Do not call me a N-word," using the actual word. The school district, however, has a zero tolerance, one strike and you're out policy governing the use of that word. It's a well-intentioned policy instituted to ensure a safe and respectful learning environment for a diverse body of students. Unfortunately, it's also a policy that the security guard appears purely as a technicality to have violated, and he's summarily fired by the principal. I'm happy to say that after a public outcry, the guard was later reinstated. At a cross-country meet in Ohio, a 16-year-old Muslim woman is disqualified for wearing a hijab during the race. She attends a private Muslim school, but participates in athletics for the local public high school. Because her coach neglected to fill out before the race the proper paperwork for a special clothing waiver, which she would have received as a matter of course, she's told by the race directors after the race that her headwear, which though made by Nike brings her no competitive advantage, violates regulations governing athletic uniforms. She had her personal best time in the race. What we see in both these cases is an overzealous, even thoughtless application of a rule. This normative stubbornness, as a kind of autopilot rule following, leads to what any reasonable person should regard as wrong-headed and even unjust treatment. The problem is that the rule enforcers are not thinking hard enough about what they're doing, and therefore they're acting unreasonably. What all such situations call for is not just a recognition that a particular rule applies to a particular set of circumstances, but something more: good judgment. Judgment is a matter of discretion. A discreet person knows when and when not to say or do something. She's good at assessing an individual or situation and determining what is called for in word and deed. By contrast, an indiscreet person will typically say or do the wrong thing, something inappropriate or offensive. Judgment in the moral sphere, where it involves action, is a matter of reasonable discrimination. A person with good judgment recognizes both what is typical and what is distinctive about the particular case at hand, and then notes whether what is distinctive is relevant. The teenage runner was indeed wearing a hijab for which her coach forgot to seek a waiver. What mattered was not the headscarf's brand or color or religious significance, but whether it gave her a competitive advantage, which it did not. Circumstances are everything. The police officer who declines to give a speeding ticket to a driver on his way to the hospital because his wife is in labor in the back seat is making a judgment call. Exercising judgment differs from either ignoring the rule or overlooking the facts and, in effect, turning the other way. When we turn the other way, we're essentially refusing to make a judgment one way or the other, and thereby abdicating responsibility. By contrast, judgment involves acknowledging that the rule has been broken and that the perpetrating party is technically guilty, but also making a conscious and deliberate choice not to enforce the rule. Just as important, and unlike turning the other way, you must be prepared, if challenged, to defend that choice with reasons. It is to recognize that the full application of the rule would result in an unjust, or at least undesirable, state of affairs. Knowing when a belief is justified and when it is not, tailoring your beliefs to the available and appropriate evidence, not holding on to a belief when it's clearly refuted by the facts. This is what it means to be epistemically rational. Exercising discretion in our actions, knowing what we're doing and why we're doing it, acting on our very best judgment, this is what it means to be practically or normatively rational. What it all comes down to is something that Socrates insisted on nearly 2.5 millennia ago. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates insists that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Socrates' idea of an unexamined life might seem easy enough to describe in a general way. It's the life of someone who never seriously questions things, least of all his own actions and plans. Such a person might indeed ask whether his actions or those of his friends or community or government are expedient or popular or even pleasant, but he does not, or only rarely, ask whether they are in fact good. The unexamined life is a life of moral and intellectual passivity. But what exactly is demanded in an examined life? At the very least, it requires a careful examination of one's action in the light of one's values and principles. You need to ask whether, given what you believe about right and wrong and good and bad, what you are doing is the right thing or what you are pursuing is good. You need to engage in reflection on the moral character of your actions. But that is only one stage of an examined life. Even more important is the second stage, where you engage in reflection on and examination of those principles and values themselves. This is where you ask, are my beliefs about what is right and good and true justified? Do I truly know what is right and what is good? Or, on the contrary, am I acting only on guesswork, a hunch, or some faith in what someone else might have told me or done? This kind of reflection on your moral thinking itself is crucial in the process of self-examination. And this brings us back to rationality and good thinking. For the most important part of the examined life is having knowledge of what you know and what you do not know. The opposite of epistemic stubbornness is epistemic humility. And by this, we do not mean an undervaluation of yourself and your epistemic condition. It does not mean any kind of self-deprecation. Rather, it means taking an accurate assessment of where you stand, taking stock of your beliefs to see which are truly justified, and not thinking that you know what you do not really know. We opened our book with a diagnosis of a serious problem, one that threatens our health, but also the fabric of our society and even the existence of our planet. We'd like to close this presentation as we close the book with a prescription. What can we do to cure bad thinking in its various manifestations as epistemic and normative stubbornness? A good first step in dealing with irrationality in thought and in action is simply to acknowledge its existence and its distinctness from other deficiencies like ignorance or stupidity. There is, after all, no easy cure for stupidity. As philosophers and academics, we place our hope in education. Instruction in philosophy, and the earlier, the better, can only deepen one's understanding of how reasoning works, how good evidence differs from bad, how premises support a conclusion, and how to form and maintain or give up beliefs in a rational manner. Philosophers have long been devoted to cataloging and examining a variety of argument forms. These efforts are not undertaken merely as an intellectual exercise, a pursuit of pleasure of the kind that a challenging Sudoku game may offer. Philosophers understand that rational belief that rests on a solid ground of justification, is our best hope for living good, comfortable, healthy lives in a healthy environment. The discoveries that have improved our lives, and not just things like medicines and technologies, but also ideas about sound governance, justice, and civil rights, grew from arguments of just the sort that philosophical training prepares one to evaluate. This brings us to our next point. Apart from its focus on reasons, justification, and rationality, philosophy imparts a different kind of wisdom as well. We can learn from philosophy what it means to live an examined life, a life in which one takes the trouble to discover what one really does and does not know, a life of epistemic humility that reflects values that lead not just to personal fulfillment and equanimity, rather than resentment and hatred, but to reasonable approaches to social, political, and environmental problems. And although we've been emphasizing the role that philosophy might play in curbing epistemic stubbornness, we would be remiss in not recognizing the importance of the humanities more generally in teaching young minds how to think critically. At a recent gathering of parents of incoming students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one parent asked how, given the cost of tuition, she could possibly justify her daughter taking classes in ancient Greek or modern art or medieval philosophy or other frivolous subjects, rather than courses that will help her in her career goals. The easy reply to this parent is, if you're paying that much money in tuition, you better hope that your daughter or son is taking such humanities courses and science courses and arts courses. After all, you're sending her to a major university, not a technical college or vocational school. How, in fact, could you justify spending the money to send her here and not have her take advantage of everything the university has to offer? This parent's underappreciation of the value of the humanities in her students' education may seem relatively harmless. After all, the student was going to take what she wanted to take, no matter what, or perhaps in spite of what her parents wanted. But in fact, it reflects a larger, very public distrust of, and even onslaught against, the humanities on our campuses, something that seems even more pervasive in England. Universities and colleges are cutting back humanities departments, either by consolidating them, dropping majors, or eliminating departments altogether. The defense of the humanities typically takes the form of an appeal to the way in which its discipline molds young minds, or fosters critical thinking, or makes for enlightened citizenship. These are platitudes, one and all, but no less true for their generality. And when we consider what exactly it is that students acquire in their humanities courses, an ability to make sense of texts, events, and works of creativity, the skill to communicate their thoughts in a clear and compelling manner, an informed and analytical understanding of our historical, political, economic, and ecological situation, it's not difficult to see just how philosophy, history, literary and cultural studies, and art history contribute to preparing young people for being intelligent and responsible citizens. I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lawrence, for that wonderful talk. Really interesting. I have lots of questions myself, and the audience is coming up with a few nice questions as well. I believe we've got 15 or 20 minutes to go through a few of them.
Great.
So I wonder whether I might indulge myself and ask a question about conspiracy theories to begin with. So you mentioned a problem with conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists. Some philosophers would seem to disagree. So some philosophers say that conspiracy theorists serve an important function. They consider the possibilities that other people neglect, or they exhibit even intellectual virtues by, for instance, engaging in strenuous search for the truth. I was wondering what you might say in response to those philosophers.
The reason why conspiracy theories, or not the reason, but a reason conspiracy theorists have so much traction, I think, is because sometimes there really is a conspiracy. And I think one should applaud the conspiracy theorists' initial skepticism. And I think this is the virtue, Robert, that you're pointing to. Conspiracy theorists are skeptical, and skepticism has a significant role to play in the acquisition of knowledge. You learn things, you come to know things by doubting things and confirming whether these doubts are justified or not. So I think conspiracy thinking has some virtues, namely the emphasis on skepticism. But the kinds of conspiracy theories that we see pervading United States culture, as well as the culture of other countries, have moved beyond this initial sort of skepticism and have embraced a kind of what's known as confirmation bias, where the people involved in these conspiracy theories refuse to consider any evidence that might be contrary to what it is they want to believe. And so they end up skeptical initially, but then not at all skeptical with respect to the evidence that they should be evaluating when testing their hypotheses. So there's something beneficial, I agree with you, about conspiracy theories, but there's a real danger involved in taking the theories themselves without due caution.
Thank you. That's great. I have a related question, if that's okay, from the audience. So Sophia has asked, why do some people fall for bad thinking and others don't? Is there an attempt to answer this from a psychological perspective?
There's another book I wanted to write, which would deal with the psychology of conspiracy thinking. And I know there are researchers who are concerned with identifying the kinds of contexts, background, home life that promote conspiratorial thinking versus those backgrounds, exposure to different kinds of education that provide a kind of vaccination against conspiracy theorists. So unfortunately, because I haven't written that book, I can't speak more intelligently about what all these conditions are. But I don't think that there's sort of a type of person who is a conspiracy theorist. The one thing that's interesting about conspiracy theories is that they're as common among the well-educated as the uneducated, the wealthy as the poor, Republicans and Democrats in my country. So I think Sophia's question is right, that there's got to be some sort of psychological answer to this question that moves beyond things like class and education and religion and political affiliation. And I wish I knew what it was.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Moving away from conspiracy theories for the moment, I have a question about the study of philosophy. So given everything you say, are you worried about the fact that the number of people studying philosophy worldwide is in decline?
I am. I'm very worried about this. For the reasons that I've been discussing for the past half hour or so, it's obvious that I think that philosophy plays a crucial role in helping us to understand the world and understand the situations that we face, ever more dire situations, it would seem. And the reason for this decline in philosophy seems to me itself ill-advised. So we have politicians in the United States like Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, who claimed we need more welders and fewer philosophers. And I mentioned that philosophy departments are being shuttered both in the US and in England. So I'm very concerned about the decline in philosophy, and not just philosophy, but humanities more generally, because philosophy is very important in teaching people how to think correctly and how to evaluate arguments and how to assess reasons. I'm currently working on a book relevant to this question. It's a book in which I'm looking at various scientists who dismiss the importance of philosophy. Scientists who say philosophy used to be important, but is no longer, or philosophy was never important. And the book I'm writing argues that science itself can't make progress in contributions of philosophy. And the reason why I like the thesis that I'm defending here is because there are a number of schools who are pushing all their funding into the so-called STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and whatever the M stands for, mathematics. And I think this reallocation of funds away from humanities into the sciences is going to harm the sciences themselves, if my thesis is correct, that without the contributions of philosophy, science can't make progress on some very important problems. So I see the decline in funding for philosophy and the general public sentiment that is whispered everywhere that philosophy is kind of frivolous or not important. I think this is just going to lead to terrible consequences.
Thank you. So along a similar theme, given the sort of pressing situations we find ourselves in at the moment, James has asked, how do philosophers persuade tech firms to understand the value of philosophy in managing their platforms and moderating damaging false and manipulative narratives?
What was the noun? How do they convince?
So how do philosophers, how are philosophers going to persuade tech firms to understand the value of philosophy in managing?
Yeah. Some already do. So there are a number of tech firms that hire philosophers to work on. These are sometimes called ontology engineers, where these philosophers are involved in the creation of software, but trying to define terms and write code that can recognize in sort of non-arbitrary ways what constitutes the objects about which this code is about. So there are a number of tech firms that already employ philosophers, and it's a myth that the philosopher the person who graduates with a degree in philosophy is going to have a harder time finding a job than someone who in a STEM field. In fact, there have been studies done that show that philosophers a few years after graduating are making more money than MBAs are making. Philosophers are valued for their ability to communicate and write clearly. They're valued for their analytical capabilities, and these skills are important in the kind of tech fields that we see in Silicon Valley. So I'm not sure that the assumption behind the question that tech firms are failing to recognize the value of philosophy is correct. I think a number already do.
That's very encouraging. Thank you. I have a fascinating question here from Tricia, who asks, what do you think the allure of irrational thinking is?
For one thing, it's easy. It's easy to simply believe something without bothering to search for the evidence. The reason why courses in logic and probability are hard is because these topics are hard. And I mentioned in the talk that I don't think you need to take courses in logic and probability to be a good reasoner. If that were true, we'd see philosophers would be kings, I guess, once more, and we'd see a lot more kind of poor judgment in the world around us. But it certainly takes time and trouble to collect evidence and think hard about the reasons for holding a certain kind of belief. And this is time consuming, it's mentally taxing, and so much easier just to sort of take someone's word for it or to Google something without bothering to reflect on the justifications involved for a particular sort of belief. So I think the ease with which irrationality can be accepted is one reason it's popular, and another is this bias I mentioned earlier, the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is a bias in favor of a belief. One comes to be more confident in the truth of this belief simply because one fails to consider evidence that the belief might be wrong. And here I can return to the earlier question about psychology. Psychologists have studied the confirmation bias, and we're all prone to it. It's in a way good to look only for evidence that favors your belief and ignore the evidence against it in some contexts. But I think we have a psychological bias for just wanting, for focusing just on the evidence in favor of the belief that we want to be true. So that's another reason why irrationality is as pervasive as it is.
Lovely, thank you. I have a quick question of my own, if you allow one. So it relates to the idea of evidentialism, which you discuss in depth in the book. And there's a problem for evidentialism. The problem of, well, there's one at least that you deal with in the book, which is prudential reasoning. But there's another called the problem of forgotten evidence. Some people call it. So I seem to believe a lot of things, but I don't always retain my evidence for those. So I may remember that the Promenade des Anglais is in Nice, but I don't recall how I found out. And then I don't have my reasons. And it sounds as though on evidentialism, that would make me irrational in continuing to believe that. Is there something that you have to say in response to that kind of worry?
Probably nothing greatly satisfying. I want to steer away from a hard commitment to evidentialism. This view of evidentialism that Robert is describing here is the view that Clifford expresses in that quotation I had, that it's just simply wrong to believe something without sufficient evidence. And surely that's too strong a claim. We can't spend our lives looking for justification for everything we believe, or else we'd never get anything done. And one of the problems that you, Robert, are correctly pointing out is that we often believe things and we no longer remember what justifies our belief in particular things. But it seems to me that we want to then temper the evidentialist claim and in some way add on to it some sorts of conditions. Like if the belief that we're accepting is of particular importance, such as a belief about the seaworthiness of a ship that's carrying passengers, then we shouldn't rely just on what we think we remember the inspectors of the ship told us. We should go to additional efforts to make sure that the ship is seaworthy because of the consequences of being wrong about that belief. So I would want to factor into our search for justification the importance of the belief for which we're seeking that justification.
Thank you. I have here a question about, well, a couple of questions really about whether the problems that we face currently are exacerbated by social media. I wonder whether you could say something about how important you think that is in this sort of epidemic of irrationality. That observation is an important one. Things are so much worse today, I think, than they were several decades ago because of the alacrity with which conspiracy theories can spread. It used to be that, we had our newspaper once in the morning and that's when we got our news, or the news came on at 6 p.m. and that was it for the news for the day. And now with social media, as everyone knows, we're bombarded 24 hours a day with all sorts of crazy theories, and we don't have time to challenge every theory the way we need to in order to be epistemically responsible agents. And it's not just that we're bombarded all the time with what people are telling us. We now have things like ChatGPT and other artificial intelligences that are making things up, not just words, but images as well. And I fear that the advent of these new artificial intelligence technologies is only going to exacerbate the role of social media in misinformation. So certainly social media is to blame for a large part of the increase in conspiracy theories, and we need some policies to help prevent this. I'm not myself a policymaker, so I wouldn't know where to begin in designing such a policy, but it seems to me that surely we can do better than what we've done. Thank you. Well, I think we're getting close to running out of time, so perhaps just some very brief thoughts on one question someone has asked. To counter this sort of epidemic of bad thinking, should we be educating children in school in philosophical thinking, and are we failing to do that sufficiently?
Yes, and yes. Look, we teach our children algebra. We teach them geometry. And there's no reason why you couldn't teach children of the same age concepts from logic and probability. Philosophy is not harder than other topics. It just is. It's not for whatever reason given the same sort of value that things like history and math and literature is given in primary school. I think I would love to see more education, more philosophical education going on for younger students.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I would just like to thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for your wonderful thoughts following the questions. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Lawrence's book, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, it's available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. For more information on the book sales, please go to the festival website or head directly to Fox Lane Books. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lawrence.